Okay. I think we're live. Gonna be reading again today. We're going to talk about a section which the author describes as being very important to understanding. And in my reading through a second time, I am trying to conceptualize, and I thought it would be valuable to have it recorded so I could revisit it again. We will start with psychic structure of the animal man, or Pasu, and then immediately go into archetypal memory and reason. Psychic structure of the animal man, or Pasu. At the time in which the spirit spheres were to be enchained to the Pasu, millions of years ago, the latter had arrived to a determined point in phylogenetic evolution. This point is the one we are going to represent, leaving aside the history of said evolution. At that moment in their history, the psychic structure of the Pasu was comprised of two well-developed spheres, affective and rational, and a third, pre-conscious, in a slow process of formation. In the schema of Figure 11, the affective, 4, and rational, 3 spheres have been eccentrically represented in relation to the weaker sphere, the pre-conscious, 2. But more important from the potential point of view. In effect, the sphere 2 is, if you will, the key to the drama, since the evolutive failure of the Pasu was rooted in the almost null development of this sphere after millions of years of Manu activity. The entelechy of the Pasu, the perfection of equaling the Manu archetype, fundamentally relied on the evolution of the conscious sphere, then of the pre-conscious, as it was necessary to complete the subsequent discovery of the work and from the work of the author, i.e., of the entities, of the entity, and of God, the One. For this reason, we have centered the spheres 2 in Figure 11, although it will be to the more developed spheres 3 and 4, to which more attention will be given. The psychic structure of the Pasu was sustained naturally in the biological body in certain highly differentiated systems. For example, the affective sphere was linked to the endocrine system and the rational sphere to the central nervous system, especially to the old, or archencephalon brain. The preconscious sphere emerged from a rudimentary neocortex, or new brain, and, at that time, was only an epiphenomenon, a dim phosphorescence that scarcely suggested what later came to be the conscious sphere, i.e., the seat of the conscious subject, or soul of the Pasu. Spheres 2, 3, and 4 constitute the psychic structure proper. The nexus between it and the world is realized through the sensorial sphere. That, for this reason, appears in Figure 11 surrounding or including the psychic structure in its interior. But the sensorial sphere is also comprised of the internal senses, of the viscera, or interoceptors, of the movements of the body, or proprioceptors, of pain, or nociceptors, etc., in addition to the exteroceptors, or receptors of exterior stimuli, hearing, sight, touch, etc. The Pasu, being a discoverer entity of entities, its cognitive activity was concentrated in the sensorial sphere, through which it received news of the world that allowed it to adapt and conduct itself in it with intelligence. In the man of today, the lost Virya, behavior is comprised, roughly, of conduct and consciousness. Conduct is the exterior behavior, and consciousness, or mental life, the interior behavior. The consciousness can freely direct the conduct by means of an energy called will placed at its disposal. But things did not occur this way in the Passu. The behavior was almost exclusively centered on conduct, and this one governed by an interminable multiplicity of fixed patterns. That is why it is considered that the conduct of the Passu was determined by an instinctive will. However, the conduct was not absolutely mechanical, since the patterns of conduct had in not absolutely mechanical, However, the conduct was not absolutely mechanical, since the patterns of conduct had, in their majority, a rational origin, although, after produced and experienced, they were reproduced as acquired characters. In the schema of Figure 11, we can see the generation area of the instinctive will in the instinct's enclosure, which is formed by the intersection of the affective and rational spheres. The instinctive will was directed to fulfill distinct necessities: conservation, appetite, reproduction, etc., and also gregarious association. In this gregarious instinct, more than in any other activity, was where the human nature of the Passu was better seen. Every society is based on communication among its members. The superior objective of Passu society was the communal communication of the discovery of the entities, or, in other terms, to transform individual discovery into collective knowledge. This means that the plan of the demiurge for the Passu was eminently cultural, and it can thus be comprehended that the evolutive failure of the Passu manifested itself exteriorly in the cultural poverty reached by its societies. Hence, the Hyperborean wisdom affirms that the spirits were captivated and chained to the Passu because they were necessary to produce culture. But culture, understood in this manner, is something very different to the sum of human activity. We will have the opportunity to go deeper into this concept later on. Archetypal memory and reason. A general description of the psychic structure of the Passu has been made. To comprehend its functioning, especially to know how the Passu complies with its finality of being a discoverer of entities, a giver of meaning to the material order of the universe, we must start with a fundamental concept: memory. We can distinguish three classes of memory by referring to the schema of Figure 11, each one of them linked to a sphere. The affective sphere, 4, corresponds to a psychophysiological memory, or habit memory. The rational sphere, 3, is linked to the important archetypal memory, and the preconscious sphere, 2, to the representative memory. Subnote 4. Subnote 4 reads, a fourth memory will be studied further on, the memory of the blood, which is linked to the sphere of egoic will, a sphere proper to the lost Virya and therefore not yet defined. However, such as will be made manifest in Article C of the next section, there is another important memory called conceptual, situated between the archetypal memory and the representative memory. End of subnote 4. Let us comment on each one of such memories. The first memory, psychophysiological, is basically sensitive, specializing in retaining memories relating to the world. That is why it is the seat of the patterns of habit. In it is conserved all that is necessary to ensure individual survival and, in addition, that which contributes to improve such survival, i.e., everything gregarious or social. This memory of habits was principally determining the instinctive will of the Passu. The third memory, representative, was incipient in the Passu, and only after the enchainment of the spirit, when the Passu was transformed into a lost Virya, was it sufficiently developed. Perhaps it may cause surprise to notice that the conscious sphere is considered as a form of memory, but as soon as it is meditated on, it will be comprehended that remembering and representing what is remembered is an essential characteristic of consciousness. This characteristic is closely related with the problem of temporality, with the faculty that the consciousness possesses to provide representations with an immanent time, psychic, in substitution of the real time that may have corresponded to the original fact that is remembered and represented. It will be demonstrated in the functioning of the conscious sphere section that consciousness is a historical subject, and that the conscious sphere is the history of the microcosm, i.e., a kind of memory. The second memory, archetypal, to which we deliberately leave for last, is the last one that for now interests us the most. The concept of archetypal memory is so important that it can be justly affirmed that its ignorance, or its absence in any philosophical system, is sufficient to situate the assumed position to the margin of the Hyperborean wisdom. We recommend, then, not advance without having comprehended in profundity the concept that is expounded next. In Figure 9, you see an analogical schema of the universe of the One, to which also tends to be called macrocosm. This denomination is adopted when it is understood that man is a minor mundus, a microcosm that reflects the major mundus or macrocosm. Such conception is sustained since ancient times and, as far as Western thought is concerned, is found in Greece, in the times of the pre-Socratics and with Anaximenes, Pythagoras, etc., in Plato and Aristotle, in the Neoplatonists, Gnostics, Christian mystics, Kabbalists, alchemists, in modern philosophy with Leibniz, etc., and of course form part of the religious traditions of China, Japan, Tibet, and India, especially in esoteric Buddhism. However, despite such enormous expansion, the principal consequences, even logical, emerging from the concept have remained in the esoteric terrain to this day. We, by affirming the ancient idea of the macrocosm as a principle of the Hyperborean wisdom, will at times find ourselves in need of emphasizing puerile relationships, but that, because of the esoteric character pointed out, tend not to be evident at all. But we will do it, even at the risk of, as in the well-known anecdote of the egg of Columbus, producing irritation to make us notice something that, then, we will believe we should have noticed ourselves. It is what occurs with the subject of reflection. From so much affirming without reflection that the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, no one notices anymore that every reflection is an inverted copy of the original. This quality, which seems a puerility to emphasize, is a question of the utmost importance, since its consideration enables to easily comprehend the function of reason and the functioning of the rational sphere. Let us see, then, how the ancient concept should be interpreted. We already possess a description of the macrocosm according to the schema of Figure 9. The microcosm or material body of the Passu, as a reflection of the macrocosm, must contain a replica of all its parts. This means that in the material body, a sector must exist that reproduces the archetypal plane, and that the copy of the universal archetypes must be in said sector, and that said copies must be inverted in relation to the original. Such properties of the material body or microcosm allow us to elaborate the following definition. The collection of all the universal archetypes of the microcosm, the inverted copies of the universal archetypes of the macrocosm, is called archetypal memory. The seat of the archetypal memory, i.e., of the biological replica of the archetypal plane, is the neurophysiological structure of the brain. Grossly, it can be affirmed that the entire brain is the archetypal memory. However, although the scalpel penetrates the profundities of the encephalic mass, Molecular biology invents formulas of cellular macromolecules. Genetics can decipher the code of the sugar phosphate bonds of the nucleic acids, or engineers construct models that simulate brain functioning in cybernetic systems. We say, nevertheless, in spite of these and other scientific prodigies, no one succeeded nor ever will succeed in empirically discover the archetypes, which, as we have said, constitute the whole brain. And this is not by lack of scientific ability or by an error of methodology, but by the essential impossibility of the human being, passu or virya, to perceive the universal archetypes through the sensorial sphere. Certainly, not only the archetypes of the brain, but also those that sustain any entity. As long as they are universal, they cannot be known through the sensorial sphere. Of the entity, only its design can be known, its particular terminus. This impossibility will be better comprehended if we previously define what is understood by reason in the Hyperborean wisdom. But, as we are studying here in the psychic structure of the passu, the definition that we will give refers fundamentally to said primitive type of man. In the virya, due to the evolution of the neocortex, the brain then allowed greater rational specialization. However, the pointed impossibility still subsists, and its origin continues being the one we are going to expose. The brain is a specialized cellular organization to the biological sciences. To the Hyperborean wisdom, the brain is archetypal memory. The brain, or archetypal memory, functions by the will of a rational subject, or reason, of which activity can always be reduced to two basic operations, one transcendent and the other immanent. The first operation of reason is transcendent comparison, and the second is immanent interpretation. The first operation has for its mission to discover the design of the entities, and the second to interpret such design in semic terms. It is what will be explained step by step below. First operation of comparing. Let's get a little drink. The schema of Figure 11 shows us the psychic structure of the passu surrounded by the sensorial sphere. In the animal man, the sensorial sphere fulfills the function of receiving stimuli from the world and converting them into nerve impulses destined for the brain, i.e., it is an intermediary between the internal and the external. But the sensorial sphere does not respond in the same way to different stimuli, and it itself varies appreciably from one passu to another. It is necessary, then, to refer to sensitivity. We clarify the meaning of the term. The capacity that presents a determined sensorial sphere to respond with greater or lesser intensity to a given stimulus is called sensitivity. In Figure 11, the circumference that limits the sensorial sphere is analogous to the sensitivity. Now, if we observe Figure 11, we see that the sensitive affects the three spheres of the psychic structure. There is thus an affective sensitivity, a rational sensitivity, and a conscious sensitivity. And any of the three types of sensation can be the object of sensitive intuition. It should be clear that the rational operation that we are describing solely uses that which reaches the rational sphere, i.e., the product of rational sensitivity. The object of sensitivity is the reality, and within this, the external entities that constitute it. In this, and in all the commentaries that follow, we are going to consider the sensorial sphere impressioned by an external entity, except in those cases in which the contrary is expressly clear. We can describe now the first operation of reason, which we call transcendent because it occupies itself with comparing the stimuli that cross the sensorial sphere and that were caused by an external entity. This is, the transcendent operation of reason consists in comparing automatically that impression that the rational sensitivity takes in from an external entity. We now know with precision that the first operation of reason is a comparison. But comparison with what? Because comparing consists in establishing relationships between two objects, which allow to discover their differences or similarities. Answer: the entity is collated with the archetypes. Of course, one must go deeper into this answer to make comprehensible the discovering effect that the first operation exerts on the entity. As we said earlier, two termini coexist in the entity, one universal and the other particular. The universal terminus is the archetype, or the collection of archetypes if it is compound, that sustains it as an entity and toward which points its evolution as finality. The particular terminus is the design that the demiurge has fixed in every entity as suprafinality. The first terminus makes of the entity a being in itself. The second terminus says that the entity is a being for man. When an entity impressions the rational sensitivity, the first operation of reason consists in submitting the received impression to comparison with the archetypal memory. There will always be at least one archetype in this memory that is an inverted copy of the universal archetype that sustains the entity, and with it, the comparison is operated. It is to say that reason only compares a universal terminus of the entity, the universal archetype, with its inverted copy, a particular archetype of the archetypal memory. It is easily comprehended that it can only occur this way because only inverted copies of the universal archetypes exist in the archetypal memory, the intellectual finality of the entities, and any copy or reference of the particular designs of each entity, the suprafinality of the being for man, does not exist. What arises from the confrontation between the universal archetype of the entity and its inverted copy of the archetypal memory? Answer: nothing. It is like adding plus with minus, a positive unit with a negative unit. Its result is zero. This signifies that reason automatically eliminates the universal terminus of the entity and leaves the particular terminus or design uncovered. Only then can the entity be known and named. But this naming is not possible, as some believe, because man is Logos. The true Logos is the demiurge who has designated the entities. The Passu, after its discovery, can only repeat that which was previously assigned to the entity. Leaving the problem of knowledge for later, one can now understand, after deciphering the first operation of reason, why we were affirming that there is an impossibility for the human being, Passu or Virya, to perceive the universal archetypes through the sensorial sphere. The impossibility exists so long as the apprehension is rational and the apprehended entity is an exterior entity. But it must also be understood once and for all that reason is a function of the archetypal memory, i.e. of the brain, and that the first rational operation invariably consists in the elimination of the universal archetype, the universal terminus of the entity, by comparison with its inverted copy. This occurs and cannot be altered because the archetypal memory is a structure, i.e. a whole of which parts are solidly linked, while reason is a function that consists in interlinking certain elements of that structure, but without modifying the structure itself. In the brain, according to official science, rational operations consist of certain bioelectric interconnections or synapses that are effectuated between clusters of specialized cells. However, no matter how much one thinks, and no matter how multiple the networks of neural interconnections that produce such thinking are, the cellular structure of the brain itself is never permanently modified. Just as it is not possible for neuronal activity to modify the structure of the brain, neither the rational function modifies the archetypal structure. And this equivalence is exact because the brain and the archetypal memory are one and the same thing. Only that the neurophysiological explication pertains to the official science of the West, and the structural explication to the Hyperborean wisdom. The impossibility of perceiving the universal archetypes that sustain external entities is also called irrepresentability. With this word, we want to signify that representation is not possible, i.e., mental vision of the universal archetypes, which by no means implies that they cannot be known. But knowledge has to come from a confrontation effectuated on a supra-rational level. Supra-rational. In another sphere. The Passu in the preconscious sphere, 2, and the Vira in the conscious sphere, 2. Second operation, relating. The second operation of reason is called immanent because it consists in establishing relationships between exclusively interior objects of the psychic structure. When the entity has been discovered by the first operation, it establishes relationships between its interiorized particular design and the archetypes of the archetypal memory, and with the archetypes among themselves. But to explain this operation, it is necessary to previously describe the cultural structure, which will be done in the next section. As a conclusion of this brief exposition of the archetypal memory, it is important to emphasize that reason, its function, in the first operation, takes the external entity and, after eliminating the universal terminus, discovers the particular that there is in it. This going from the universal to the particular is the most general kind of deduction. The essence of the deductive, all deduction is always a posteriori to the first operation, but, in its form, derivable from it. The first operation is a priori to any other reasoning about the entity because it is indispensable to discover the entity and place it under observation. But by taking the external entity, lost in the universal, and situating it in the internal as a particular design, a transcendental deduction is being effectuated. Contrarily, the second operation will take the discovered entity in its particular design and relate it with the archetypes of the archetypal memory, i.e., with the universal of the microcosm. This going from the particular to the universal is the most general kind of induction, the essence of the inductive. All induction derives from the second operation. But by taking the internally discovered entity and relating it to archetypes of the microcosm, an immanent induction is being carried out, i.e., circumscribed in the interior of the animal man being, or Passu. Functioning of the Passu's cultural structure. Passu. Views. Who's watching? Anyone? No. Great. With the same reserves and considerations that we made when proposing the model of the sphere, we are going to utilize the structural model to complete the conceptual description of the psychic structure of the Passu. Why must we use a new model? Because here we are going to develop the following concept. The archetypal memory, brain, is the given, that which the animal man inherits complete, and that it cannot modify. However, founded on the archetypal memory, there is something that is being constructed throughout life, the cultural structure. The answer is, then, to comprehend the cultural structure, of which growth is a product of the operations of reason, we will utilize the structural model since it keeps the necessary and sufficient correspondences. A. The structural model. The first thing that we must do before we occupy ourselves with the cultural structure is to acquire a clear notion about what a structure is. For this we are going to proceed inductively, starting from the intuition of a simple geometric structure and extending said intuition to structures of greater complexity. An elemental geometric structure widely utilized as a model in physics has been represented in Figure 12, known as the body-centered cubic crystal lattice. It is possible to imagine structures of this type in which the polygon of the face is other than the square, with which no cubes would be obtained but polyhedra such as the octahedron, dodecahedron, icosahedron, etc. A lattice is comprised of the bonds of a set of similar polyhedra. However, the lattice that we need as a model is not integrated with such polyhedra, but must be able to include all the possible polyhedra and must ensure the possible connection with one another in the structure. We will now study the geometric structure of Figure 12. We deduce from simple observation that it is comprised of 4 elements: certain protuberances called nodes at the vertexes and center of the cube, the bond between the nodes, the space that occupies its extension, and time that allows it to last or change. But the first thing that calls the attention is the interrelation that binds all the members, given that it is possible to reach any of the nodes starting from any other by just advancing on the bonds. This topological quality permits us to enunciate that the whole conditions the part in a structure. In addition, the members are articulated in the overall shape in such a manner that, for example, in Figure 12, we could not remove a node without destroying the cubic shape. And also, there is interaction between the members, since, if in the same figure we attribute mass to the cubic structure, for example, it turns out that by eliminating a node, the static equilibrium that it might have reached is altered. On the other hand, submitting the cubic structure of Figure 12 to dynamic conditions, for example a displacement or a rotation, it can be concluded that the members are solidary and that they are all functionally interpenetrated. In summary, we can characterize the structure as an organization or bond of members articulated in a whole, interdependent, solidary, interactive, and functionally interpenetrated. B. Nodes and bonds of the cultural structure. The archetypal memory or brain is inherited, unmodifiable, but its function, reason, is capable of effectuating a permanent structural construction, at least throughout the life of the passu. But this construction does not proceed from an act of choice, from the will of the subject, but from the mode of being of reason. In effect, reason produces elements of the cultural structure by the sole fact of acting, members that are bonded with the whole and remain definitively articulated. The function of reason as a producer of the cultural structure obeys the finality that the demiurge has fixed for the destiny of the passu, to be a discoverer of entities, and from the entities to be a producer of culture. Culture, gregarious, social, or collective application of the knowledge of the entities, is the act that truly gives meaning to the world by its external character to the microcosm, for being seated in the macrocosm. Later on, we will have the opportunity to study the cultural act in the historical framework of the Kali Yuga. We will apply the recently exposed structural model to explain the structuring effect of reason. Remembering the quadruple constitution of a structure, we have to begin asking, what is the space in which the cultural structure is constructed? Answer: the cultural structure is a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. See Figure 11. This answer leads us to the problem of the nature of the spheres. What are the spheres? Here we affirm the energetic nature of the psychic structure of the passu, and such definition may generate the prejudice that the concept of energy is being applied to the psyche. Against this objection, we reply that contrarily, there is a concept of energy because the psyche is energetic. Thus, psychic substance is energy, a superior form of matter in which this is reduced to pure force. The space in an energetic sphere is always reducible to vectorial space, which justifies the choice of the structural method by its topological correspondences. The cultural structure, which is formed by the action of reason, takes place in the affective and rational spheres as a substratum of these, i.e., its place is at the bottom, deep down at the base, near the archetypal memory of the brain, which is what supports the affective and rational spheres. Let us now see how said structure is formed. Let us remember the first operation of reason. Reason compares the universal archetype of the entity with the inverted archetype in the archetypal memory. From this comparison, the universal archetype of the entity is eliminated, leaving only the particular terminus or design. But, to effectuate the comparison, reason has had to locate the inverted archetype and, once located, confront it with the entity, i.e., with the impression that the external entity has produced on the rational sensitivity, as we defined earlier. Herein lies the origin of the cultural structure. As a product of localization, which the first operation of reason effectuates in the inverted archetype, a second effect occurs. The first effect is the elimination of the universal terminus. The second is the actualization, in the microcosm, of the inverted archetype. The first effect is, then, the cause of the second. The first operation of reason thus produces, apart from the transcendental deduction, in which it eliminates the universal terminus, an archetypal actualization in the microcosm of the inverted copy of the eliminated universal terminus. Let us leave aside for the moment the first effect, the elimination of the universal terminus, and turn our attention to the actualization of the inverted archetype. If we remember that the archetypal memory is analogous to the archetypal plane of the macrocosm in the microcosm, we can verify that the actualization of an inverted archetype is analogous to that of any universal archetype. On the archetypal plane, the archetypes are perfect but potential beings. The actualization of an archetype consists in its manifestation on a plane of realization. When this plane is, for example, matter, the manifestation produces material entities that participate in a greater or lesser degree of the archetypal perfection. In the Orient, it is said that the manifestation of the archetypes on the material plane is effectuated by the impulse of the breath from the demiurge, i.e., by a cosmic puff, a universal pneuma. But this puff is not a mere rhythmic expulsion because it possesses direction, since it is directed to the plane of realization, the direction that determines the plasmating impulse of the universal archetypes to be directed to the material plane, and not to any other world, is the intention of the demiurge. That intention is what impulses the entities to evolve toward the entelechy of the archetypes, and, as breath is synonymous with will, it is said that intention is the direction of the will of the demiurge. Entelechy is the finality to which tend the phenomic processes that constitute the reality of the entities. But in every entity there are, as we have seen, two finalities, one universal and the other particular. This is due to the existence, in every entity, of a double demiurgic intention. A first intention plasmates and impulses the entity toward the entelechy of the archetype of which it participates. It is the finality. A second intention designates to the entity a being for man. It is the suprafinality. Therefore, the entity is the act of the universal archetype, but an essentially intentioned act, produced by a directioning of the will of the demiurge. Let us now consider the archetypal memory or brain of the Passu, which is a reflection or an inverted copy of the archetypal plane. Reason is a function of the archetypal memory, but reason is something that moves, that establishes relationships. What is the force that impulses the reason of the Passu? Answer: the instinctive will. Reason is directed toward the inverted archetype of an entity given to the senses, moved by the instinctive will. This means that the reference established between the inverted archetype and the entity to the effect of the comparison is not passive but active. It is not static but dynamic, i.e., it is intentional. Naturally, such a reference has nothing to do with consciousness, since the latter is a historical subject that was not yet existing in the passé. In every case, such an intentional reference was, and is, subconscious. The intentional character with which reason refers to the localized archetype is what produces its actualization and, with it, the increase of the cultural structure. But the actualization of an archetype must effectuate itself on a plane of realization. What is, in the microcosm, this plane on which the inverted archetypes manifest themselves? Answer: the psyche, or soul, of the passé, concretely in the profundity of the affective and rational spheres. This answer coincides with that which we had previously given to the question for the space in which the cultural structure is constructed, since we said then that this was a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. Now we can complete the concept saying that the space that occupies a cultural structure is the plane of realization of the archetypes of the archetypal memory, that is, the energetic spheres of the psyche. We have not yet explained how the cultural structure is constructed, but where it takes place. We will be able to begin this explanation after exposing a fundamental concept that, due to its importance, should not be forgotten in any of the subsequent analyses. It consists in the following. All psychic phenomena is of a semic character. Without entering into the problem of the continuity that the psyche of the passé has to maintain as an energetic sphere, it is indubitable that every psyche is the deposit of multi-phenomenic content. The preceding enunciation affirms that the imminent discovery of the psychic is semic. Pursuant to this, psychic contents are symbolic. But let us not be confused. The symbol is not a mere aggregate to the psychic content, a property of it, but the content itself, its essence. In this way, the semic is the essence of the psychic, and that is why every fact that possesses a psychic termination manifests itself semically or polysemically. We will now study how the cultural structure is constructed. We already advanced that its origin lay in the actualization that the rational reference was producing in the inverted archetype as a second effect of the comparison. The actualization of an inverted archetype, analogously to that of a universal archetype of the macrocosm, manifests itself on a plane of realization, the psyche. But, as recently seen, such manifestation must be semic. The actualized inverted archetype effectively manifests itself as a symbol in the psychic sphere, which constitutes a member of this cultural structure. Which member? The one that corresponds to the node, and to which we will denominate principle, or simple symbol. In other terms, when reason locates an archetype in the archetypal memory, the referential intentionality impulses it to manifest itself in the psyche where it is structured as a principle or a simple symbol. Let us now consider the first operation of reason, complete in its two effects. By comparing the entity with the archetypal memory, the confrontation of the universal archetype of the entity with its inverted copy is produced, i.e. two contraries are opposed. The first effect of this operation is the elimination or negation of the universal archetype of the entity and, with it, the discovery of the design or superfinality. And as second effect, the manifestation or affirmation of the inverted archetype in the cultural structure as a principle, i.e. occupying the place of a node. The first effect, as we see, has discovered the entity in its design. Let us see what occurs next. First of all, we must qualify the discovery of the design as a transcendence of the external entity, which is thus situated beyond the sensorial sphere. In effect, while the universal archetype can never be seen outside the entity, nor in the entity itself, for it is absolutely immanent, The design of the entity is ready to be for man, to transcend all barriers and reveal itself in plenitude. In other words, the design becomes an interior object. As we said before, equivalence does not exist in the archetypal memory for the design of entities, since, justly, the finality of the animal man is to discover that design and to give meaning to the world. That is why the design, as an interior object, is the subject of the second operation of reason, relating. What does reason do with the design of the entity? Answer: it interprets it. To interpret the design, reason searches the archetypes of the archetypal memory, most adequate or congruent, and with them forms a schema of the entity. Here there is not, as in the first operation, any elimination of the archetypes. On the contrary, the affirmation of one or several of them, necessary to interpret the design, is produced. That is to say, as an effect of the second operation of reason, which establishes relationships between the design of the entity and the archetypal memory, the actualization of one or several archetypes is produced. But actualization is manifestation in the psychic sphere, in the ambit of the cultural structure. Here's what occurs. The whole of the actualized archetypes, which intervene in the interpretation of a design, manifests itself in the psyche as a complex symbol that represents the schema of the entity and is structured at the bonds. Such bonds are denominated relationships. A structure is constructed with bonds between nodes. The cultural structure is constructed by reason with relationships between principles. The cultural structure is, thus, a psychic organization of energetic substance and semic essence, the members of which are complex symbols that relate or bond to simple symbols or principles, archetypal. But up to now, we have only seen how one node and one bond are constructed. We still need to know how the cultural structure grows and what relation it has with the total psychic structure of the Pasu to, from there, comprehend its functioning. This will be the object of the next article, after we say a few words about the second operation of reason. The second operation, which we previously described as immanent induction, consists, as we have now seen, in interpreting the design of the entity by means of the relationships between archetypes of the archetypal memory. This operation, interpreting, supposes, if one looks at it, the existence of a criterion. But such criterion is not the product of the decision of the Pasu, but, on the contrary, every decision is a posteriori to him and is conditioned by him. It is so because it is a criterion pattern. Reason operates impulsed by the instinctive will, i.e., subject to patterns of conduct, and the second operation adjusts itself to a pattern that is a pure form of criterion. But this rational criterion, which intervenes a priori to understanding, is manifestly hereditary since it constitutes a form or mode of reason, i.e., of a function of the archetypal memory or brain, which is given because it is inherited. With this, we want to emphasize that the interpretation of the design must vary from one Pasu to another according to the degree of precision that the hereditary rational criterion permits each one to attain. C. The cultural structure as a memory. A node of the cultural structure or principle is the semic correspondence of an archetype of the archetypal memory. A bond or relationship is the semic correspondence of the design of an entity, its schema, according to the interpretation effectuated by reason. Ever since the life of the Pasu is initiated, ever since its sensorial sphere is exposed to the impression of the entities of the world, multiple nodes and similar bonds are being added to the cultural structure by the archetypal actualization that produces reason. The cultural structure grows, then, constantly, both in the number of members and in the complexity of the frame, while what is already structured remains as a substratum of the affective and rational spheres. This permanence inevitably brings up the problem of time, i.e. that of the relation between transcendent time, or time of the entities, and immanent time, or psychic time, the solution of which will be given later on. But even when we have not entered into said problem, it must be understood that the permanence of the cultural structure converts it into a kind of memory, not archetypal, like the brain, but experiential, i.e., the product of the experience of the entities. The archetypal memory is passive and static, hereditary. The cultural structure, as memory, is active and dynamic, experiential. For reasons that we will see later, the cultural structure is also denominated by the Hyperborean wisdom conceptual memory. Of course, the objects of this memory, what is truly memorized, are the relationships between principles, since the principles are mere semic actualizations of the archetypes of the archetypal memory. The relationships, or bonds of the cultural structure, constitute the truth of the entities for the Passu, since they represent the rational interpretation of the design, and therefore an explanation of the functioning of the psychic structure has to principally aim to expose the nature of such bonds or relationships. It should be surprising, then, that we dedicate the major part of the next article to these. D. Principles and relationships as systems. If we remember our earlier convention about how, unless otherwise clarified, all explanations would be exemplified by external entities, we can delve into the definition of relationship. For the Passu, a relationship is, before all else, the truth of the entity. But here one must observe that we do not say the essence, but the truth of the entity. This distinction indicates that the essence of the entity is the design, whereas the relationship is a rational correlate, the interpretation of the design or schema, that which is truly known, and therefore the truth of the entity. The truth of the entity is memorized by the cultural structure as a complex symbol or relationship, i.e. as a semic bond between principles or simple symbols. Now, what is a complex symbol comprised of? Of a group of simple symbols structured to constitute the schema of the entity. A complex symbol, relationship, or bond of the cultural structure is, in turn, a semic structure of a lower degree denominated substructure. This property of the complex symbol or relationship of being a substructure of the simple symbols poses a problem that requires clarification before continuing with its study. In effect, if a complex symbol or relationship is a bond between simple symbols or principles, can these principles also be included in the group of simple symbols in which the complex symbol consists? I.e., can the principles in the cultural structure be repeated? Answer: simple symbols can exist as principles in place of nodes or as constituent elements of complex symbols in place of bonds. The difference lies in the potency. Principles are passive potencies, whereas relationships are active potencies. But as the concept of potency requires the consideration of transcendent time, we will not enter into its definition now, since it will be done ahead. Suspending until then, therefore, such definition, let us remember that the principles come from the first operation of reason, when the universal archetype of the entity is compared with the inverted archetype of the archetypal memory. It is the intentional reference that actualizes the archetype in the cultural structure as a principle or passive potency. But the elimination of the universal archetype has caused the discovery of the design, of the being for man of the entity, and to that revelation, reason interprets it by means of the second operation, which consists in referring to the design of the archetypes necessary to obtain a schema. The archetypes of reference, among which may appear the same as that used to eliminate the universal, are actualized in the cultural structure, forming a complex symbol, relationship, or active potency. The representation in the cultural structure of an inverted archetype as a node is called principle. If in the same archetype is represented in a relationship as a semic element of its substructure, such element is denominated archetypal symbol. If an archetypal symbol and a principle represent the same archetype, they differ only in potency. The principle possesses a passive potency, and the archetypal symbol, like every relationship, has active potency. The same inverted archetype can, thus, have a symbolic correspondence with a principle or semic element of the relationship. However, it is fundamental to understand this. While the very same simple symbol can represent both a principle and a semic element of a relationship, it will never be structured more than once as a principle or node, and instead will be substructured countless times as a semic element of relationships or bonds. This means that once reason has compared an entity with an archetype and the latter has manifested and structured itself as a principle or passive potency, it does not matter the number of times that such an operation is effectuated again, with that or with other entities. The archetype never manifests itself more than once as a principle. In every case, what occurs is that the reiterated rational references to an archetype for its comparison increment the passive potency of the corresponding principle or node. The greater potency is necessary because, the principles being unique in the cultural structure, they must support all the relationships that refer to them. We are in the case, for example, in which a determinate node of figure 12 would have to support countless bonds. It would have for it to foresee some manner of reinforcing the node to each new bond, thus avoiding that the structure is weakened. This reinforcement effectuates in the principles the increment of passive potency. This condition of unique, unrepeatable nodes should give an idea of the complexity of the cultural structure that each principle has. Think of any principle, for example the number 1, and one can imagine the impressive quantity of relationships with which is linked in our own cultural structure. So far, the fact that an archetype is represented by a single principle and also by very many simple symbols substructured in the various relationships has been clarified. We will next go on to study in greater detail the complexion of the relationships. In the structural model we are using, a relationship between principles is analogous to a bond between nodes of figure 12, i.e., to a cylindrical bar such as the one represented in figure 13. The actual dimensions of the bond are space, time, and substance. Naturally, the space occupied by the cylinder can be in turn characterized by qualitative dimensions such as length, width, or thickness, surface area, volume, etc. The analogy between the relationship and the cylindrical bond will allow us to define certain characteristic dimensions. In a relationship, time and substance are reduced in the concept of potency, which will be defined in the next section. As for space, the analogy is established in relation to the length and volume of a cylindrical bond. In summary, every relationship is defined based on 3 dimensions: its extension, analogous to length, its comprehension, equivalent to volume, and its potency. Minus the potency, we are going to define extension and comprehension, making the clarification that, in general, they should be considered valid not only for schemata of external entities, but for all the relationships, whatever the represented entity is. The extension of a relationship, analogous to the length of a bond, denotes the class of all the simple symbols that intervene in the substructure of the complex symbol or relationship. The more extensive a relationship is, the greater the quantity of semic elements that it encompasses. The comprehension of a relationship, analogous to the volume of the bond, indicates how close the schematic truth is to coinciding with the essence of the entity or design. The comprehension is thus the substructure itself, the semic schema of the entity of which truth represents the relationship. That is why its exactitude to comprehend the essence of the entity depends on the interpretation effectuated by the second operation of reason, i.e., it depends on the hereditary criterion. A greater volume of the bond equates to a greater comprehension of the relationship, i.e., the relationship is more comprehensive in properties corresponding to the design structured as simple symbols. We have spoken of principles and the relationships, and now we know something more of both. But if we consider it as a whole and pay attention to some common properties, we will soon be in conditions to study the functioning of the cultural structure of the Pasu in its totality, such as the title of this section was promising. First of all, let us note that the principles do not proceed from a sensitive intuition, but have been structured by effect of it. The principles, as a semic representation of innate archetypes, are a priori to all reasoning or reflection and determinants of understanding. The Pasu will find or intuit them and identify them with pure symbols, innate ideas, numbers, mental categories, etc., or will improperly call them archetypes. On the contrary, the relationships have their origin in sensitive intuition, or rather are pure creations of reason. They constitute, for the Pasu, the substance of all rational thought. It is evident that the cultural structure is comprised of a small number of principles and a countless number of relationships. But unlike what occurs in the cubic structure of Figure 12, the conditions imposed on the cultural structure must be able to include all possible polyhedra and must ensure the possible connections of one with another causes a relationship. It can connect itself with multiple principles. We would then not be in the analogy of the cylindrical bar, and it may suppose an invalidation of our conclusions. That is why, to dissipate any doubt and to facilitate the exposition, we are going to use the notion of a system. In the structure, parts do not exist, but members, which are solidary, interactive, interdependent, etc., with the whole. Excuse me. I'm going to step away for just 1 second, but I will be right back. Oh, you got a peek at my basement. I'm exposed. In the structure, parts do not exist but members, which are solidary, interactive, interdependent, etc., with the whole. Hence, a system, which can be a sector or the whole structure, should be considered as an arbitrary abstraction rather than as a part. Structural morphology divides systems into simple and complex. In conformity with this, we will define, in general, a system as the class of all relationships that are linked with common principles. Additionally, a simple system is the class of all relationships that are linked with a pair of opposite principles. It is convenient to define an operation called reduction in the following terms. There is a function between the principles and the relationships in every simple system, such that it is always possible to assimilate the similar symbols of each relationship and reduce the number of bonds. But systematic reduction will always be possible to topologically simplify the polyhedric lattice to its minimum expression, one bond and two knots, i.e., a relationship between two principles. A minimal system is thus arrived at, represented in Figure 13, in which the relationship is linked at the beginning and end of its extension with two opposite principles. It is then said that it is a dialectical relationship. The systematic reduction, considered as a mental function, is also called rational synthesis. It is clear that the minimal system in Figure 13 is a substructure, according to the definition we gave earlier on the complex symbol. Consequently, we can generalize the reduction for every simple system in the following way. Every simple system is a substructure susceptible to a semiotic reduction. But, and this should be even clearer, only the relationships are reducible. The principles are absolutely irreducible. In any manner, if every simple system can be brought into the form of Figure 13, the general validity of the preceding definitions of principles and relationships is confirmed. We are now in conditions to expose the concept of the complex system. It is a substructure that possesses n pairs of opposite principles and that, by systematic reduction, is decomposed into a group of n systems. Henceforth, when we say system, it should be understood as simple system, unless clarification to the contrary. How much more and how much? Starting to get interrupted. Yeah. I will have to stop it right here, and we will continue next time I have the opportunity. Thank you for joining me today. Stay tuned.